Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of My Disillusionment in Russia by Emma Goldman. Chapter 28, originally published as Chapter 7 of My Further Disillusionment in Russia. Persecution of Anarchists.
In a country state-owned and controlled as completely as Russia, it is almost impossible to live without the grace of the government. However, I was determined to make the attempt. I would accept nothing, not even bread rations, from the hands stained with the blood of the brave Kronstadt sailors. Fortunately, I had some clothing left me by an American friend. It could be exchanged for provisions. I had also received some money from my own people in the United States. That would enable me to live for some time. In Moscow, I procured a small room formerly occupied by the daughter of Peter Kropotkin. From that day on, I lived like thousands of other Russians, carrying water, chopping wood, washing and cooking, all in my little room. But I felt freer and better for it. The new economic policy turned Moscow into a vast marketplace. Trade became the new religion. Shops and stores sprang up overnight, mysteriously stacked with delicacies Russia had not seen for years. Large quantities of butter, cheese, and meat were displayed for sale. Pastry, rare fruit, and sweets of every variety were to be purchased. In the building of the first house of the Soviet, one of the biggest pastry shops had been opened. Men, women, and children with pinched faces and hungry eyes stood about gazing into the windows and discussing the great miracle. What was, but yesterday considered a heinous offense, was now flaunted before them in an open and legal manner. I overheard a Red soldier say, "Is this what we made the revolution for? For this our comrades had to die?" The slogan, "Rob the robbers," was now turned into "Respect the robbers," and again was proclaimed the sanctity of private property. Russia was thus gradually resurrecting the social conditions that the Great Revolution had come to destroy. But the return to capitalism in no way changed the Bolshevik attitude toward the left elements. Bourgeois ideas and practices were to be encouraged to develop the industrial life of Russia, but revolutionary tendencies were to be suppressed as before. In connection with Kronstadt, a general raid on anarchists took place in Petrograd and Moscow. The prisons were filled with these victims. Almost every known anarchist had been arrested, and the anarchist bookstores and printing offices of Golos Truda in both cities were sealed by the Cheka. The Ukrainian anarchists who had been arrested on the eve of the Kharkov Conference, though guaranteed immunity by the Bolsheviki under the Makhno Agreement, were brought to Moscow and placed in the Butyrki. That Romanov dungeon was again serving its old purpose, even holding some of the revolutionists incarcerated there before. Presently it became known that the politicals in the Butyrki had been brutally assaulted by the Cheka and secretly deported to unknown parts. Moscow was much agitated by this resurrection of the worst prison methods of Tsarism. Interpellation on the subject was made in the Moscow Soviet, the indignation of the deputies being so great that the Cheka representative was shouted off the platform. Several Moscow anarchist groups sent a vigorous protest to the authorities, which document I quote in part. The undersigned anarcho-syndicalist organizations, after having carefully considered the situation that has developed lately in connection with the persecution of anarchists in Moscow, Petrograd, Kharkov, and other cities of Russia and the Ukraine, including the forcible suppression of anarchist organizations, clubs, publications, etc., hereby express their decisive and energetic protest against this despotic crushing of not only every agitational and propagandistic activity, but even of all purely cultural work by anarchist organizations. The systematic manhunt of anarchists in general, and of anarcho-syndicalists in particular, with the result that every prison and jail in Soviet Russia is filled with our comrades, fully coincided in time and spirit with Lenin's speech at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. On that occasion, Lenin announced that the most merciless war must be declared against what he termed petty bourgeois anarchist elements, which, according to him, are developing even within the Communist Party itself, owing to the anarcho-syndicalist tendencies of the labor opposition. On that very day that Lenin made the above statements, numbers of anarchists were arrested all over the country, without the least cause or explanation. No charges have been preferred against any one of the imprisoned comrades, though some of them have already been condemned to long terms without hearing or trial, and in their absence. The conditions of their imprisonment are exceptionally vile and brutal. Thus, one of the arrested, Comrade Maximov, after numerous vain protests against the incredibly unhygienic conditions in which he was forced to exist, was driven to the only means of protest left him, a hunger strike. Another comrade, Yarchuk, released after an imprisonment of 6 days, was soon rearrested without any charges being preferred against him on either occasion. According to reliable information received by us, some of the arrested anarchists are being sent to the prisons of Samara, far away from home and friends, and thus deprived of what little comradely assistance they might have been able to receive nearer home. A number of other comrades have been forced by the terrible conditions of their imprisonment to declare a hunger strike. One of them, after hungering 12 days, became dangerously ill. Even physical violence is practiced upon our comrades in prison. The statement of the anarchists in the Butyrki prison in Moscow, signed by 38 comrades and sent to the Executive Committee of the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission on March 16th, contains, among other things, the following statement. On March 15th, Comrade T. Kashirin was brutally attacked and beaten in the prison of the Special Department of the Extraordinary Commission by your agent Mago and assistants in the presence of the prison warden Dukis. Besides the wholesale arrests of and the physical violence toward our comrades, the government is waging systematic war against our educational work. It has closed a number of our clubs, as well as the Moscow office of the publishing establishment of the anarcho-syndicalist organization Golos Truda. A similar manhunt took place in Petrograd on March 15th. Numbers of anarchists were arrested. Without cause, the printing house of Golos Truda was closed and its workers imprisoned. No charges have been preferred against the arrested comrades, all of whom are still in prison. These unbearably autocratic tactics of the government towards the anarchists are unquestionably the result of the general policy of the Bolshevik state in the exclusive control of the Communist Party in regard to anarchism, syndicalism, and their adherents. This state of affairs is forcing us to raise our voices in loud protest against the panicky and brutal suppression of the anarchist movement by the Bolshevik government. Here in Russia, our voice is weak. It is stifled. The policy of the ruling Communist Party is designed to destroy absolutely every possibility or effort of anarchist activity or propaganda. The anarchists of Russia are thus forced into the condition of a complete moral hunger strike, for the government is depriving us of the possibility to carry out even those plans and projects which it itself only recently promised to aid. Realizing more clearly than ever before the truth of our anarchist ideal and the imperative need of its application to life, we are convinced that the revolutionary proletariat of the world is with us." Unquote. After the February Revolution, Russian anarchists returned from every land to Russia to devote themselves to revolutionary activity. The Bolsheviki had adopted the anarchist slogan, "The factories to the workers, the land to the peasants," and thereby won the sympathies of the anarchists. The latter saw in the Bolsheviki the spokesman of social and economic emancipation and joined forces with them. Through the October period, the anarchists worked hand in hand with the communists and fought with them side by side in the defense of the revolution. Then came the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which many anarchists considered a betrayal of the revolution. It was the first warning for them that all was not well with the Bolsheviki. But Russia was still exposed to foreign intervention, and the anarchists felt that they must continue together to fight the common enemy. In April 1918 came another blow. By order of Trotsky, the anarchist headquarters in Moscow were attacked with artillery, some anarchists wounded, a large number arrested, and all anarchist activities liquidated. This entirely unexpected outrage served further to alienate the anarchists from the ruling party. Still, the majority of them remained with the Bolsheviki. They felt that, in spite of internal persecution, to turn against the existing regime was to work into the hands of the counter-revolutionary forces. The anarchists participated in every social, educational, and economic effort. They worked even in the military departments to aid Russia. in the Red Guards, in the volunteer regiments, and later in the Red Army, as organizers and managers of factories and shops, as chiefs of the fuel bureaus, as teachers everywhere, the anarchists held difficult and responsible positions. Out of their ranks came some of the ablest men who worked in the Foreign Office with Chicherin and Karakan in the various press bureaus as Bolshevik diplomatic representatives in Turkestan, Bukhara, and the Far Eastern Republic. Throughout Russia, the anarchists worked with and for the Bolsheviki in the belief that they were advancing the cause of the revolution. But the devotion and zeal of the anarchists in no way deterred the communists from relentlessly persecuting the anarchist movement. The peculiar general situation and the confusion of ideas created in all revolutionary circles by the Bolshevik experiment divided the anarchist forces in Russia into several factions, thereby weakening their effect upon the course of the revolution. There were a number of groups, each striving separately and striving vainly against the formidable machine which they themselves had helped to create. In the dense political fog, many lost their sense of direction. They could not distinguish between the Bolsheviki and the revolution. In desperation, some anarchists were driven to underground activities, even as they had been during the regime of the Tsars. But such work was more difficult and perilous under the new rulers, and it also opened the door to the sinister machinations of provocators. The more mature anarchist organizations, such as the Nabat in the Ukraine, Golos Truda in Petrograd and Moscow, and the Voilny Trud group, the last two of anarcho-syndicalist tendency, continued their work openly as best they could. Unfortunately, as was unavoidable under the circumstances, some evil spirits had found entry into the anarchist ranks, debris washed ashore by the revolutionary tide. They were types to whom the revolution meant only destruction, occasionally even for personal advantage. They engaged in shady pursuits, and when arrested and their lives threatened, they often turned traitors and joined the Cheka. Particularly in Kharkov and Odessa thrived this poisonous weed. The anarchists at large were the first to take a stand against this element. The Bolsheviki, always anxious to secure the services of the anarchist derelicts, systematically perverted the facts. They maligned, persecuted, and hounded the anarchist movement as such. It was this communist treachery and despotism which resulted in a bombs being thrown during the session of the Moscow section of the Communist Party in September 1919. It was an act of protest, members of the various political tendencies cooperating in it. The anarchist organizations Golos Truda and Voilny Trud in Moscow publicly expressed their condemnation of such methods, but the government replied with reprisals against all anarchists. Yet, in spite of their bitter experiences and martyrdom under the Bolshevik regime, most of the anarchists clung tenaciously to the hand that smote them. It needed the outrage upon Kronstadt to rouse them from the hypnotic spell of the Bolshevik superstition. Power is corrupting, and anarchists are no exception. It must in truth be admitted that a certain anarchist element became demoralized by it. By far the largest majority retained their integrity. Neither Bolshevik persecution nor oft-attempted bribery of good position with all its special privileges succeeded in alienating the great bulk of anarchists from their ideals. As a result, they were constantly harassed and incarcerated. Their existence in the prisons was a continuous torture. In most of them still obtained the old regime, and only the collective struggle of the politicals occasionally succeeded in compelling reforms and improvements. Thus it required repeated obstructions and hunger strikes in the Butyrki before the authorities were forced to make concessions. The politicals succeeded in establishing a sort of university, organized lectures, and received visits and food parcels. But the Cheka frowned upon such liberties. Suddenly, without warning, an end was put to decent treatment. The Butyrki was raided, and the prisoners, numbering more than 400 and belonging to various revolutionary wings, were forcibly taken from their cells and transferred to other penal institutions. A message received at the time from one of the victims, dated April 27th, reads, Concentration Camp, Ryazan. On the night of April 25th, we were attacked by red soldiers and armed Chekists and ordered to dress and get ready to leave the Butyrki. Some of the politicals, fearing that they were to be taken to execution, refused to go and were terribly beaten. The women especially were maltreated, some of them being dragged down the stairs by their hair. Many have suffered serious injury. I myself was so badly beaten that my whole body feels like one big sore. We were taken out by force in our nightclothes and thrown into wagons. The comrades in our group knew nothing of the whereabouts of the rest of the politicals, including Mensheviks, social revolutionists, anarchists, and anarcho-syndicalists. 10 of us, among them Fanya Baron, have been brought here. Conditions in this prison are unbearable. No exercise, no fresh air, food is scarce and filthy. Everywhere awful dirt, bedbugs, and lice. We mean to declare a hunger strike for better treatment. We have just been told to get ready with our things. They are going to send us away again. We do not know where to. Signed T. Upon the circumstances of the Butyrki raid becoming known, the students of the Moscow University held a protest meeting and passed resolutions condemnatory of the outrage. Thereupon, the student leaders were arrested and the university closed. The non-resident students were ordered to leave Moscow within 3 days on the pretext of lack of rations. The students volunteered to give up their payok, but the government insisted on their quitting the capital. Later, when the university was reopened, Preobrazhensky, the dean, admonished the students to refrain from any political expressions on pain of being expelled from the university. Some of the arrested students were exiled, among them several girl students, for the sole crime of being members of a circle whose aim was to study the works of Kropotkin and other anarchist authors. The methods of the Tsar were resurrected by his heirs to the throne in Bolshevik Russia. After the death of Peter Kropotkin, his friends and comrades decided to found a Kropotkin museum in commemoration of the great anarchist teacher and in furtherance of his ideas and ideals. I removed to Moscow to aid in the organization of the proposed memorial, but before long, the museum committee concluded that for the time being the project could not be realized. Everything being under state monopoly, nothing could be done without application to the authorities. To accept government aid would have been a deliberate betrayal of the spirit of Kropotkin, who throughout his life consistently refused state assistance. Once, when Kropotkin was ill and in need, the Bolshevik government offered him a large sum for the right to publish his works. Kropotkin refused. He was compelled to accept rations and medical assistance when sick, but he would neither consent to his works being published by the state nor accept any other aid from it. The Kropotkin Museum Committee took the same attitude. It accepted from the Moscow Soviet the house Kropotkin had been born in, and which was to be turned into a Kropotkin museum. But it would ask the government for nothing more. The house at the time was occupied by a military organization. It would require months to get it vacated, and then no means would be at hand to have it renovated. Some of the committee members felt that a Kropotkin museum was out of place in Bolshevik Russia as long as despotism was rampant and the prisons filled with political dissenters. While I was in Petrograd on a short visit, the Moscow apartment in which I had a room was raided by the Cheka. I learned that the customary trap had been set and everyone arrested who called at the place during the zasada. I visited Ravitch to protest against such proceedings, telling her that if the object was to take me into custody, I was prepared for it. Ravitch had heard nothing of the matter, but promised to get in touch with Moscow. A few days later, I was informed that the Chekists had been withdrawn from the apartment and that the arrested friends were about to be released. When I returned to my room some time later, most of them had been freed. At the same time, a number of anarchists were arrested in various parts of the capital, and no news of their fate or of the cause of their arrest could be learned. Several weeks later, on August 30th, the Moscow Izvestia published the official report of the Vecheka concerning anarchist banditism, announcing that 10 anarchists had been shot as bandits without hearing or trial. It had become the established policy of the Bolshevik government to mask its barbaric procedure against anarchists with the uniform charge of banditism. This accusation was made practically against all arrested anarchists and frequently even against sympathizers with the movement. A very convenient method of getting rid of an undesirable person. By it, anyone could be secretly executed and buried. Among the 10 victims were 2 of the best-known Russian anarchists, whose idealism and lifelong devotion to the cause of humanity had stood the test of Tsarist dungeons and exile, and persecution and suffering in other countries. They were Fanya Baron, who several months before had escaped from the Ryazan prison, and Lev Cherny, who had spent many years of his life in katorga and exile under the old regime. The Bolsheviki did not have the courage to say that they had shot Lev Cherny. In the list of the executed, he appeared as Turchaninov, which, though his real name, was unfamiliar to some even of his closest friends. Cherny was known throughout Russia as a gifted poet and writer. In 1907, he had published an original work on associational anarchism. And since his return from Siberia in 1917, he had enjoyed wide popularity among the workers of Moscow as a lecturer and founder of the Federation of Brain Workers. He was a man of great gifts, tender and sympathetic in all his relationships. No person could be further from banditism. The mother of Cherny had repeatedly called at the Osoby Odel, special department of the Cheka, to learn the fate of her son. Every time she was told to come next day, she would then be permitted to see him. As established later, Cherny had already been shot when these promises were being made. After his death, the authorities refused to turn his body over to his relatives or friends for burial. There were persistent rumors that the Cheka had not intended to execute Cherny, but that he died under torture. Fanya Baron was of the type of Russian woman completely consecrated to the cause of humanity, while in America she gave all her spare time and a goodly part of her meager earnings in a factory to further anarchist propaganda. Years afterward, when I met her in Kharkov, her zeal and devotion had become intensified by the persecution she and her comrades had endured since their return to Russia. She possessed unbounded courage and a generous spirit. She could perform the most difficult task and deprive herself of the last piece of bread with grace and utter selflessness. Under harrowing conditions of travel, Fanya went up and down the Ukraina to spread the Nabat, organize the workers and peasants, or bring help and succor to her imprisoned comrades. She was one of the victims of the Butyrki raid, when she had been dragged by her hair and badly beaten. After her escape from the Ryazan prison, she tramped on foot to Moscow, where she arrived in tatters and penniless. It was her desperate condition which drove her to seek shelter with her husband's brother, at whose house she was discovered by the Cheka. This big-hearted woman, who had served the social revolution all her life, was done to death by the people who pretended to be the advance guard of revolution. Not content with the crime of killing Fanya Baron, the Soviet government put the stigma of banditism on the memory of their dead victim.
Chapter 29, originally published as Chapter 8 of my further disillusionment in Russia. Traveling salesman of the revolution.
Great preparations were being made by the Communists for the Third Congress of the Third International and the First Congress of the Red Trade Union International. A preliminary committee had been organized in the summer of 1920, while delegates from various countries were in Moscow. How much the Bolsheviki depended upon the First Congress of the Red Trade Union International was apparent from a remark of an old communist. "We haven't the workers in the Third International," he said. "Unless we succeed in welding together the proletariat of the world into the RTUI, the Third International cannot last very long." The Hotel de Luxe, renovated the previous year, became the foreign guest house of the Third International and was put in festive attire. The delegates began to arrive in Moscow. During my stay in Russia, I came across 3 classes of visitors who came to study the revolution. The first category consisted of earnest idealists to whom the Bolsheviki were the symbol of the revolution. Among them were many emigrants from America who had given up everything they possessed to return to the Promised Land. Most of these became bitterly disappointed after the first few months and sought to get out of Russia. Others, who did not come as communists, joined the Communist Party for selfish reasons and did in Rome as the Romans do. There were also the anarchist deportees who came not of their own choice. Most of them strained every effort to leave Russia after they realized the stupendous deception that had been imposed on the world. In the second class were journalists, newspapermen, and some adventurers. they spent from 2 weeks to 2 months in Russia, usually in Petrograd or Moscow, as the guests of the government and in charge of Bolshevik guides. Hardly any of them knew the language, and they never got further than the surface of things. Yet many of them have presumed to write and lecture authoritatively about the Russian situation. I remember my astonishment when I read in a certain London daily that the teachings of Jesus were being realized in Russia, a preposterous falsehood of which none but a charlatan could be guilty. Other writers were not much nearer the truth. If they were at all critical of the Bolsheviki, they were so at the expense of the whole Russian people, whom they charged with being crude, primitive savages, too illiterate to grasp the meaning of the revolution. According to these writers, it was the Russian people who imposed upon the Bolsheviki their despotic and cruel methods. It did not occur to those so-called investigators that the revolution was made by those primitive and illiterate people, and not by the present rulers in the Kremlin. Surely they must have possessed some quality which enabled them to rise to revolutionary heights, a quality which, if properly directed, would have prevented the wreck and ruin of Russia. But that quality has persistently been overlooked by Bolshevik apologists who sacrifice all truth in their determination to find extenuating circumstances for the mess made by the Bolsheviki. A few wrote with understanding of the complex problems and with sympathy for the Russian people, but their voice was ineffectual in the popular craze that Bolshevism had become. The third category, the majority of the visitors, delegates, and members of various commissions, infested Russia to become the agents of the ruling party. These people had every opportunity to see things as they were, to get close to the Russian people, and to learn from them the whole terrible truth. But they preferred to side with the government, to listen to its interpretation of causes and effects. Then they went forth to misrepresent and to lie deliberately in behalf of the Bolsheviki, as the Entente agents had lied and misrepresented the Russian Revolution. Nor did the sincere communists realize the disgrace of the situation, not even Angelika Balabanova. Yet she had good judgment of character and knew how to appraise the people who flocked to Russia. Her experience with Mrs. Claire Sheridan was characteristic. The lady had been smuggled into Russia before Moscow realized that she was the cousin of Winston Churchill. She was obsessed by the desire to sculp prominent communists. She had also begged Angelika to sit for her. "Lenin, Trotsky, and other leaders are going to, aren't you?" she pleaded. Angelika, who hated sensationalism in any form, resented the presence in Russia of these superficial visitors. "I asked her," she afterward related, "if she would have thought of sculping Lenin 3 years ago when the English government denounced him as a German spy. Lenin did not make the revolution. The Russian people made it. I told this Mrs. Sheridan that she would do better to sculp Russian working men and women who were the real heroes of the revolution." I know she did not like what I said. But I don't care. I can't stand people to whom the Russian struggle is mere copy for poor imitations or cheap display. Now the new delegates were beginning to arrive. They were royally welcomed and feted. They were taken to show schools, children's homes, colonies, and model factories. It was the traditional Potemkin villages that were shown the visitors. They were graciously received and talked to by Lenin and Trotsky, treated to theaters, concerts, ballets, excursions, and military parades. In short, nothing was left undone to put the delegates into a frame of mind favorable to the great plan that was to be revealed to them at the Red Trade Union and the Third International Congresses. There were also continuous private conferences where the delegates were subjected to a regular third-degree, Lozovsky prominent Bolshevik labor leader, and his retinue seeking to ascertain their attitude to the Third International, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and similar subjects. Here and there was a delegate who refused to divulge the instructions of his organization on the ground that he was pledged to report only to the Congress. But such naive people reckoned without their host. They soon found themselves ostracized, and at the Congress they were given no opportunity to make themselves heard effectively. The majority of the delegates were more pliable. They learned quickly that pledges and responsibilities were considered bourgeois superstitions. To show their ultra-radicalism, they quickly divested themselves of them. They became the echoes of Zinoviev, Lozovsky, and other leaders. The American delegates to the Red Trade Union International were most conspicuous by their lack of personality. They accepted without question every proposition and suggestion of the chair. The most flagrant intrigues and political machinations and brazen suppression of those who would not be cajoled or bullied into blind adherence found ready support by the American communist crew and the aides they had brought with them. The Bolsheviki know how to set the stage to produce an impression. In the staging of the two congresses held in July 1921, they outdid themselves. The background for the Congress of the Third International was the Kremlin. In the royal halls where once the all-powerful Romanovs had sat, the awed delegates hung with bated breath upon every word uttered by their Pope, Lenin, and the other grand seigneurs of the Communist Church. On the eve of the Congress, a great meeting was held in the big theater, to which only those whose passports had been approved by the all-Russian Cheka were admitted. The streets leading to the theater were turned into a veritable military camp. Chekists and soldiers on foot and on horseback created the proper atmosphere for the communist conclave. At the meeting, resolutions were passed extending fraternal greetings to the revolutionists in capitalist prisons. At that very moment, every Russian prison was filled with revolutionists, but no greetings were sent to them. So all-pervading was Moscow hypnotism that not a single voice was raised to point out the farce of Bolshevik sympathy for political prisoners. The Red Trade Union Congress was set on a less pretentious scale in the House of the Trade Unions, but no details were overlooked to get the proper effects. Delegates from Palestine and Korea, men who had not been out of Russia for years. Delegates from the great industrial centers of Bokhara, Turkestan, and Azerbaijan packed the Congress to swell the communist vote and help carry every communist proposition. They were there to teach the workers of Europe and America how to reconstruct their respective countries and to establish communism after the World Revolution. The plan perfected by Moscow during the year 1920-21, and which was a complete reversal of communist principles and tactics, was very skillfully and subtly unrolled by slow degrees before the credulous delegates. The Red Trade Union International was to embrace all revolutionary and syndicalist organizations of the world, with Moscow as its Mecca and the Third International as its prophet. All minor revolutionary labor organizations were to be dissolved, and communist units formed instead within the existing conservative trade union bodies. The very people who a year ago had issued the famous Bull of 21 Points, they who had excommunicated every heretic unwilling to submit to the orders of the Holy See, the Third International, and who had applied every invective to labor in the Second and the 2.5 Internationals, were now making overtures to the most reactionary labor organizations and resoluting against the best efforts of the revolutionary pioneers in the trade union movement of every country. Here again the American delegates proved themselves worthy of their hire. Most of them had sprung from the industrial workers of the world, had indeed arisen to fame and glory on the shoulders of that militant American labor body. Some of the delegates had valiantly escaped to safety, unselfishly preferring the Hotel de Luce to Leavenworth Penitentiary, leaving their comrades behind in American prisons and their friends to refund the bonds they had heroically forfeited. While industrial workers continued to suffer persecution in capitalistic America, the renegade IWWs living in comfort and safety in Moscow maligned and attacked their former comrades and schemed to destroy their organization. Together with the Bolsheviki, they were going to carry out the job begun by the American vigilantes and the Ku Klux Klan to exterminate the IWW. Les extrêmes se touchent. While the communists were passing eloquent resolutions of protest against the imprisonment of revolutionaries in foreign countries, the anarchists in the Bolshevik prisons of Russia were being driven to desperation by their long imprisonment without opportunity for a hearing or trial. To force the hand of the government, the anarchists incarcerated in the Taganka, Moscow, decided on a hunger strike to the death. The French, Spanish, and Italian anarcho-syndicalists, when informed of the situation, promised to raise the question at an early session of the Labor Congress. Some, however, suggested that the government be first approached on the matter. Thereupon a delegate committee was chosen, including the well-known English labor leader, Tom Mann, to call upon the Little Father in the Kremlin. The committee visited Lenin. The latter refused to have the anarchists released on the ground that they were too dangerous, but the final result of the interview was a promise that they would be permitted to leave Russia. Should they, however, return without permission, they would be shot. The next day, Lenin's promise was substantiated by a letter of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, signed by Trotsky, reiterating what Lenin had said. Naturally, the threat of shooting was omitted in the official letter. The hunger strikers in the Taganka accepted the conditions of deportation. They had for years fought and bled for the revolution, and now they were compelled to become ahasueruses in foreign lands or suffer slow mental and physical death in Bolshevik dungeons. The Moscow anarchist groups chose Alexander Berkman and A. Shapiro as their representatives on the delegates committee to arrange with the government the conditions of the release and deportation of the imprisoned anarchists. In view of this settlement of the matter, the intention of a public protest at the Congress was abandoned by the delegates. Great was their amazement when, just before the close of the Congress, Bukharin, in the name of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, launched into a scurrilous attack on the anarchists. Some of the foreign delegates, outraged by the dishonorable proceeding, demanded an opportunity to reply. That demand was finally granted to a representative of the French delegation after Chairman Lozovsky had exhausted every demagogic trick in a vain attempt to silence the dissenters. At no time during the protracted negotiations on behalf of the imprisoned anarchists and the last disgraceful proceedings at the Red Trade Union Congress did the American Communist delegates make a protest. Loudly, they had shouted for political amnesty in America, but not a word had they to say in favor of the liberation of the politicals in Russia. One of the group, approached on behalf of the hunger strikers, exclaimed, "What are a few lives, or even a few hundred of them, as against the revolution?" To such communist minds, the revolution had no bearing on justice and humanity. In the face of abject want, with men, women, and children hungrily watching the white bread baked for the Lux Hotel in its adjoining bakery, one of the American fraternal delegates wrote to a publication at home that the workers in Russia control the industries and are directing the affairs of the country. They get everything free and need no money. This noble delegate lived in the palatial home of the former sugar king of Russia and enjoyed also the hospitality of the Lux. He indeed needed no money, but he knew that the workers lacked even the basic necessities and that without money they were as helpless in Russia as in any other country, the week's payok not being sufficient for 2 days' existence. Another delegate published glowing accounts dwelling on the absence of prostitution and crime in Moscow. At the same time, the Cheka was daily executing hold-up men, and on the Tverskaya and the Pushkin Boulevard near the Lux Hotel, street women mobbed the delegates with their attentions. Their best customers were the very delegates who waxed so enthusiastic about the wonders of the Bolshevik regime. The Bolsheviki realized the value of such champions and appreciated their services. They sent them forth into the world generously equipped in every sense, to perpetuate the monstrous delusion that the Bolsheviki and the revolution are identical and that the workers have come into their own under the proletarian dictatorship. Woe to those who dare to tear the mask from the lying face. In Russia they are put against the wall, exiled to slow death in famine districts, or banished from the country. In Europe and America, such heretics are dragged through the mire and morally lynched. Everywhere, the unscrupulous tools of the great disintegrator, the Third International, spread distrust and hatred in labor and radical ranks. Formerly, ideals and integrity were the impulse to revolutionary activity. Social movements were founded upon the inner needs of each country. They were maintained and supported by the interest and zeal of the workers themselves. Now, all this is condemned as worthless. Instead, the golden reign of Moscow is depended on to produce a rich crop of communist organizations and publications. Even uprisings may be organized to deceive and mislead the people as to the quality and strength of the Communist Party. In reality, everything is built on a foundation that crumbles to pieces the moment Moscow withdraws its financial support. During the two congresses held in July 1921, the friends and comrades of Maria Spiridonova circulated a manifesto which had been sent by them to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and to the main representatives of the government, calling attention to the condition of Spiridonova and demanding her release for the purpose of adequate medical treatment and care. A prominent foreign woman delegate to the Third Congress of the Communist International was approached. She promised to see Trotsky, and later it was reported that he had said that Spiridonova was still too dangerous to be liberated. It was only after accounts of her condition had appeared in the European socialist press that she was released, on condition that she return to prison on her recovery. Her friends, in whose care she is at present, face the alternative of letting Spiridonova die or turning her over to the Cheka.
Chapter 30, originally published as Chapter 9 of My Further Disillusionment in Russia. Education and Culture.
The proudest claims of the Bolsheviki are education, art, and culture. Communist propaganda literature and Bolshevik agents at home and abroad constantly sing the praises of these great achievements. To the casual observer, it may indeed appear that the Bolsheviki have accomplished wonders in this field. They have organized more schools than existed under the Tsar, and they have made them accessible to the masses. This is true of the larger cities. But in the provinces, the existing schools met the opposition of the local Bolsheviki, who closed most of them on the alleged ground of counter-revolutionary activities, or because of lack of communist teachers. While, then, in the large centers, the percentage of children attending schools and the number of higher educational institutions is greater than in the past, the same does not apply to the rest of Russia. Still, so far as quantity is concerned, the Bolsheviki deserve credit for their educational work and the general diffusion of education. In the case of the theaters, no reservations have been made. All were permitted to continue their performances when factories were shut down for want of fuel. The opera, ballet, and Lunacharsky's plays were elaborately staged, and the prolet cult organized to advance proletarian culture was generously subsidized even when the famine was at its height. It is also true that the government printing presses were kept busy day and night manufacturing propaganda literature and issuing the old classics. At the same time, the imagists and futurists gathered unmolested in Café Domino and other places. The palaces and museums were kept up in admirable condition. In any other starved, blockaded, and attacked country, all this would have been a very commendable showing. In Russia, however, two revolutions had taken place. To be sure, the February Revolution was not far-reaching. Still, it brought about political changes without which there might not have been an October. It also released great cultural forces from the prisons in Siberia, a valuable element without which the educational work of the Bolsheviki could not have been undertaken. It was the October Revolution which struck deepest into the vitals of Russia. It uprooted the old values and cleared the ground for new conceptions and forms of life. Inasmuch as the Bolsheviki became the sole medium of articulating and interpreting the promise of the revolution, the earnest student will not be content merely with the increase of schools, the continuation of the ballet, or the good condition of the museums. He will want to know whether education, culture, and art in Bolshevik Russia symbolize the spirit of the revolution, whether they serve to quicken the imagination and broaden the horizon, above all, whether they have released and helped to apply the latent qualities of the masses. Critical inquiry in Russia is a dangerous thing. No wonder so many newcomers avoided looking beneath the surface. To them, it was enough that the Montessori system, the educational ideas of Professor Dewey, and dancing by the Dalcroze method have been adopted by Russia. I do not contend against these innovations, but I insist that they have no bearing whatever on the revolution. They do not prove that the Bolshevik educational experiment is superior to similar efforts in other countries where they have been achieved without a revolution and the terrible price it involves. State monopoly of thought is everywhere interpreting education to suit its own purpose. Similarly, the Bolsheviki, to whom the state is supreme, use education to further their own ends. But while the monopoly of thought in other countries has not succeeded in entirely checking the spirit of free inquiry and critical analysis, the proletarian dictatorship has completely paralyzed every attempt at independent investigation. The communist criterion is dominant. The least divergence from official dogma and opinion on the part of teachers, educators, or pupils exposes them to the general charge of counter-revolution, resulting in discharge and expulsion, if nothing more drastic. In a previous chapter, I have mentioned the case of the Moscow University students expelled and exiled for protesting against Cheka violence toward the political prisoners in the Butyrki. But it was not only such political offenses that were punished. Offenses of a purely academic nature were treated in the same manner. Thus, the objection of some professors to communist interference in the methods of instruction was sternly suppressed. Teachers and students who supported the professors were severely punished. I know a professor of sociology and literature, a brilliant scholar and a revolutionist, who was discharged from the Moscow University because, as an anarchist, he encouraged the critical faculty of his pupils. He is but one instance of the numerous cases of non-communist intellectuals who, under one pretext or another, are systematically hounded and finally eliminated from Bolshevik institutions. The communist cells in control of every classroom have created an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion in which real education cannot thrive. It is true that the Bolsheviki have striven to carry education and culture into the Red Army and the villages, but here again the same conditions prevail. Communism is the state religion, and like all religions, it discourages the critical attitude and frowns upon independent inquiry. Yet without the capacity for parallelism and opportunity for verification, education is valueless. The prolet cult is the pet child of the Bolsheviki. Like most parents, they claim for their offspring extraordinary talents. They hold it up as the great genius who is destined to enrich the world with new values. Henceforth, the masses shall no longer drink from the poisonous well of bourgeois culture. Out of their own creative impulse, and through their own efforts, the proletariat shall bring forth great treasures in literature, art, and music. But like most child prodigies, the prolet cult did not live up to its early promise. Before long, it proved itself below the average, incapable of innovation, lacking originality, and without sustaining power. Already in 1920, I was told by two of the foremost foster fathers of the prolet cult, Gorky and Lunacharsky, that it was a failure. In Petrograd, Moscow, and throughout my travels, I had occasion to study the efforts of the prolet cult. Whether expressed in printed form, on the stage, in clay or color, they were barren of ideas or vision, and showed not a trace of the inner urge which impels creative art. They were hopelessly commonplace. I do not doubt that the masses will someday create a new culture, new art values, new forms of beauty. But these will come to life from the inner necessity of the people themselves, and not through an arbitrary will imposed upon them. The mechanistic approach to art and culture, and the idée fixe that nothing must express itself outside of the channels of the state, have stultified the cultural and artistic expression of the Russian people. In poetry and literature, in drama, painting, and music, not a single epic of the revolution has been produced during 5 years. This is the more remarkable when one bears in mind how rich Russia was in works of art, and how close her writers and poets were to the soul of the Russian people. Yet in the greatest upheaval in the world's history, no one has come forward with pen or brush or lyre to give artistic expression to the miracle or to set to music the storm that carried the Russian people forward. Works of art, like newborn man, come in pain and travail. Verily, the 5 years of revolution should have proved very rich spiritually and creatively, for in those years the soul of Russia has gone through 1,000 crucifixions. Yet in this regard, Russia was never before so poor and desolate. The Bolsheviki claim that a revolutionary period is not conducive to creative art. That contention is not borne out by the French Revolution, to mention only the Marseillaise, the great music of which lives and will live. The French Revolution was rich in spiritual effort, in poetry, painting, science, and in its great literature and letters. But then the French Revolution was never so completely in the bondage of one dogmatic idea as has been the case with Russia. The Jacobins indeed strove hard to fetter the spirit of the French Revolution, and they paid dearly for it. The Bolsheviki have been copying the destructive phases of the French Revolution, but they have done nothing that can compare with the constructive achievements of that period. I have said that nothing outstanding has been created in Russia. To be exact, I must accept the great revolutionary poem 12 by Alexander Blok. But even that gifted genius, deeply inspired by the revolution and imbued with the fire that had come to purify all life, soon ceased to create. His experience with the Cheka, he was arrested in 1919, the terrorism all about him, the senseless waste of life and energy, the suffering and hopelessness of it all depressed his spirit and broke his health. Soon Alexander Blok was no more. Even a Blok could not create with an iron band compressing his brain, the iron band of Bolshevik distrust, persecution, and censorship. How far-reaching the latter was, I realized from a document the museum expedition had discovered in Vologda. It was a very confidential secret order issued in 1920 and signed by Ulyanova, the sister of Lenin and chief of the Central Educational Department. It directed the libraries throughout Russia to eliminate all non-communist literature, except the Bible, the Quran, and the classics, including even communistic writings dealing with problems which were being solved in a different way by the existing regime. The condemned literature was to be sent to paper mills because of the scarcity of paper. Such edicts and the state monopoly of all material, printing machinery, and mediums of circulation exclude every possibility of the birth of creative work. The editor of a little cooperative paper published a brilliant poem, unsigned. It was the cry of a tortured poet's soul in protest against the continued terror. The editor was promptly arrested and his little shop closed. The author would probably have been shot had his whereabouts been known. No doubt there are many agonized cries in Russia, but they are muffled cries. No one may hear them or interpret their meaning. The future alone has the key to the cultural and artistic treasures now hidden from the Argus eyes of the Department of Education and the numerous other censorial institutions. Russia is now the dumping ground for mediocrities in art and culture. They fit into the narrow groove. They dance attendance on the all-powerful political commissars. They live in the Kremlin and skim the cream of life, while the real poets like Blok and others die of want and despair. The void in literature, poetry, and art is felt most in the theaters, the state theaters especially. I once sat through 5 hours of acting in the Alexandrovsky Theater in Petrograd when Othello was staged, with Andreeva, Gorky's wife, as Desdemona. It is hard to imagine a play more atrociously presented. I saw most of the other plays in the state theater, and not one of them gave any hint of the earthquake that had shaken Russia. There was no new note in interpretation, scenery, or method. It was all commonplace and inadequate, innocent even of the advancement made in dramatic art in bourgeois countries, and utterly inconsequential in the light of the revolution. The only exception was the Moscow Art Theater. Its performance of Gorky's Night's Lodging was especially powerful. Real art was also presented in the Stanislavski studio. These were the only oases in the art desert of Russia. But even the art theater showed no trace of the great revolutionary events Russia was living through. The repertoire which had made the art theater famous a quarter of a century before still continued night after night. There were no new Ibsens, Tolstoys, or Chekhovs to thunder their protest against the new evils, and if there had been, no theater could have staged them. It was safer to interpret the past than to voice the present. Yet, though the art theater kept strictly within the past, Stanislavski was often in difficulties with the authorities. He had suffered arrest and was once evicted from his studio. He had just moved into a new place when I visited him with Louise Bryant, who had asked me to act as her interpreter. Stanislavski looked forlorn and discouraged among his still unpacked boxes of stage property. I saw him also on several other occasions and found him almost hopeless about the future of the theater in Russia. The theater can grow only through inspiration from new works of art, he would say. Without it, the interpretive artist must stagnate, and the theater deteriorate. But Stanislavski himself was too much the creative artist to stagnate. He sought other forms of interpretation. His newest venture was an attempt to bring singing and dramatic acting into cooperative harmony. I attended a dress rehearsal of such a performance and found it very impressive. The effect of the voice was greatly enhanced by the realistic finesse which Stanislavski achieved in dramatic art. But these efforts were entirely the work of himself and his little circle of art students. They had nothing to do with the Bolsheviki of the prolet cult. There are some other innovations, begun long before the advent of the Bolsheviki, and permitted by them to continue because they have no bearing on the Russian actuality. The Kamerny Theatre registers its revolt against the imposition of the play upon the acting, against the limitation of expression involved in the orthodox interpretation of dramatic art. It achieves noteworthy results by the new mode of acting, complemented by original scenery and music, but mostly in plays of a lighter genre. Another unique attempt is essayed by the Semperante Theatre. It is based on the conception that the written drama checks the growth and diversity of the interpretive artist. Plays should therefore be improvised, thereby affording greater scope to spontaneity, inspiration, and mood of the artist. It is a novel experiment, but as the improvised plays must also keep within the limits of the state censorship, the work of the Semperantists suffers from a lack of ideas. The most interesting cultural endeavor I met in Kiev was the work of the Jewish Kulturliga. Its nucleus was organized in 1918 to minister to the needs of pogrom victims. They had to be provided for, sheltered, fed, and clothed. Young Jewish literary men and an able organizer brought the Kulturliga to life. They did not content themselves with ministering only to the physical needs of the unfortunates. They organized children's homes, public schools, high schools, evening classes. Later, a seminary and art school were added. When we visited Kiev, the Kulturliga owned a printing plant and a studio besides its other educational institutions, and had succeeded in organizing 230 branches in the Ukraine. At a literary evening and a special performance arranged in honor of the expedition, we were able to witness the extraordinary achievements of the Kulturliga. At the literary evening, Perez's poem The Four Seasons was rendered by recitative group singing. The effect was striking. Nature at the birth of spring, birds sending forth their joyous song of love, the mystery and romance of mating, the ecstasy of renewing and becoming, the rumbling of the approaching storm, the crash of the mighty giant struck by lightning, rain softly falling, the leaves fluttering to earth, the somberness and pathos of autumn, the last desperate resistance of nature against death, the trees shrouded in white, all were made vivid and alive by the new form of collective recitative. Every nuance of nature was brought out by the group of artists on the improvised little stage of the Kulturliga. The next day we visited the art school. The children's classes were the more interesting. There was no discipline, no rigid rules, no mechanistic control of their art impulses. The children did drawing, painting, and modeling, mostly Jewish motifs, a pogromed city by a boy of 14, a devout Jew in his tales praying in the synagogue, mortal fear of the pogrom savages written in his every feature, an old Jewish woman, the tragic remnant of a whole family slaughtered, and similar scenes from the life of the Russian Jew. The efforts were often crude, but there was about them nothing of the stilted manner characteristic of the prolet cult. There was no attempt to impose a definite formula on art expression. Later we attended the studio. In a bare room without scenery, lighting, costumes, or makeup, the artists of the Kulturliga gave several one-act plays and presented also an unpublished work found among the effects of a playwright. The performance had an artistic touch and finish I had rarely seen before. The play is called The End of the World. The wrath of God rolls like thunder across the world, commanding man to prepare for the end. Yet man heeds not. Then all the elements are let loose, pursuing one another in wild fury. The storm rages and shrieks, and man's groans are drowned in the terrific hour of judgment. The world goes under, and all is dead. Then something begins to move again. Black shadows symbolizing half-beast, half-man, with distorted faces and hesitating movements, crouch out of their caves. In awe and fear they stretch their trembling hands toward one another. Haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, man attempts in common effort with his fellows to lift himself out of the black void. Light begins to break. Again a thunderous voice rolls over the earth. It is the voice of fulfillment. It was a stirring artistic achievement. When the Liga was first organized, the Bolsheviki subsidized its work. Later, when they returned to Kiev after its evacuation by Denikin, They gave very scanty support to the educational institutions of the Kulturliga. This unfriendly attitude was due to the Yevkom, the Jewish communist section, which intrigues against every independent Jewish cultural endeavor. When we left Kiev, the ardent workers of the Liga were much worried about the future of the organization. I am not in a position to say at this writing whether the Liga was able to continue its work or was closed altogether. However, laudable as were the innovations of the Kulturliga and the attempts of the Kammerne and Semperante at new modes of expression, they could not be considered as having any bearing on the revolution. State support to so-called art is given mostly to Lunacharsky's dramatic ventures and other communist interpretations of culture. When I first met Lunacharsky, I thought him much less the politician than the artist. I heard him lecture at the Sverdlov University before a large audience of working men and women, popularizing the origin and development of art. It was done splendidly. When I met him again, he was so thoroughly in the meshes of party discipline and so completely shorn of his power that every effort of his was frustrated. Then he began to write plays. That was his undoing. He could not employ the material of the actual reality, and the February Revolution, Kerensky, and the Constituent Assembly had already been caricatured to a thread. Lunacharsky turned to the German Revolution. He wrote, "The Smith and the Counselor," a sort of burlesque. The play is so amateurish and commonplace that no theater outside of Russia would have cared to present it. But Lunacharsky was in control of the theaters. Why not exploit them for his own works? The play was staged at great cost, at a time when millions on the Volga were starving. But even that could have been forgiven if the play had any meaning or contained anything suggestive of the tragedy of Russia. Instead, it lacked all life, and was rich only in vulgar scenes portraying Ludendorff, the renegade social democratic president, a degenerate aristocrat, and a princess of the demimonde. The drunken men frantically scramble for the possession of the woman, literally tearing her clothing off her back. A revolting scene, yet in the whole audience of teachers and members of the Department of Education, not a single protest was voiced against the affront to the taste and intelligence of revolutionary Russia. On the contrary, they applauded the playwright, for those sycophants depended on Lunacharsky for their rations. They could not afford to be critical. Vanity and power break the strongest character, and Lunacharsky is not strong. It is his lack of will which makes him submit, against his better judgment, to the galling discipline and espionage placed over him. Perhaps he avenges himself by forcing upon the public at large and the actors under his charge his dramatic works. After a careful analysis of the educational and cultural efforts of the Bolsheviki, the earnest student will come to the following conclusions. First, there is quantity rather than substance in the education of Russia today. Secondly, the theaters, the ballet, and the museums receive generous support from the government. But the reason for it is not so much love of art as the necessity of finding some outlet for the checked and stifled aspirations of the people. The political dictatorship of the Bolsheviki with one stroke suppressed the social phase of life in Russia. There was no forum even for the most inoffensive social intercourse, no clubs, no meeting places, no restaurants, not even a dance hall. I remember the shocked expression of Zorin when I asked him if the young people could not occasionally meet for a dance free from communist supervision. Dance halls are gathering places for counter-revolutionists. We closed them, he informed me. The emotional and human needs of the people were considered dangerous to the regime. On the other hand, the dreadful existence hunger, cold, and darkness was sapping the life of the people. Gloom and despair by day, congestion, lack of light and heat at night, and no escape from it all. There was, of course, the political life of the Communist Party, a life stern and forbidding, a life without color or warmth. The masses had no contact with or interest in that life, and they were not permitted to have anything of their own. A people bottled up is a menace. Some outlet had to be provided, some relief from the black despair. The theater, the opera, and the museum were that relief. What if the theaters gave nothing new? What if the opera had bad singing? And the ballet continued to move in the old toe circles? The places were warm. They had light. They furnished the opportunity for human association, and one could forget the misery and loneliness. One might even forget the Cheka. The theater, the opera, the ballet, and the museum became the safety valve of the Bolshevik regime. And as the theaters gave nothing of protest, nothing new or vital, they were permitted to continue. They solved a great and difficult problem and furnished excellent copy for foreign propaganda.
This concludes today's reading of My Disillusionment in Russia, by Emma Goldman. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.